This is lesson 5 in the story of Joseph, a prisoner in charge. We'll begin at Genesis chapter 39, verse 21, and go through the end of chapter 40. By now, you should recognize the pattern of Joseph's life: exaltation, followed by humiliation, followed by exaltation, followed by, you get the point. In the first scene, he's exalted by his father, symbolized by a robe, which his brothers strip off him and then throw him to the bottom of a well. They eventually pull him out, but only to sell him into slavery. He goes down to Egypt, where God raises him up, puts him in charge of his master's house. But here he's falsely accused by his master's wife. He goes down again, all the way down to prison. If you've ever wondered, and surely you have, what is God doing in my life? I would encourage you to search for yourself in Joseph's story. God is committed to transforming you just as he was committed to transforming Joseph. I know it might not feel like it, but your feelings neither create nor destroy truth. Feelings just aren't trustworthy. Truth is, whether you trust it or not. If a slave can be in charge of his master's house and a prisoner can be in charge of the king's prison, then you have no idea what God may have in store for you. This scene begins with that powerful word again, but. But while Joseph was there in that prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison. This sequel feels so similar to what happened to Joseph when he was a slave that it's kind of hard to believe. Once again, we see 3 P's: presence, God is with him; prosperity, God shows him kindness. The word is hesed, which means an act of love and loyalty towards someone in need. And power, the warden puts him in charge. The narrator wants us to make a connection that when Joseph hits rock bottom, whether an empty well, a slave in Egypt, or a falsely accused prisoner, this is precisely where God shows up. Is it possible that God is most powerfully present in places where we feel like he's most conspicuously absent? Could it be that God is most engaged with us when we're at the bottom, not the top? We want the P's without the prison. We want presence and prosperity and power. What we don't want is the P where they show up. For Joseph, it was prison. For you, pick your pain. God's grace always runs downhill. It's for bottom dwellers, not the proverbial cream that rises to the top. The narrator here also uses the same Hebrew verb 3 times, each time with a different subject. His master put him in prison. The Lord granted him favor. The warden put him in charge. All this putting and granting happens to Joseph under God's providence. Notice that he is always the object. He's never the subject of this verb. To whatever extent you experience the same dynamic in your life, so are you. Transformation hurts. A substantial amount of time has to pass before God sets Joseph free. But in the midst of it, God is with him and God cares about him. The more confined you feel, the more absent he feels. And this is so counterintuitive, but the more qualified you are for God's presence and his provision. The narrator transitions, as he often does, with a time marker. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. We don't know what they did or how much time has passed. We do know that Joseph is 30 when he's finally set free from prison. We also know he was only 17 when his journey of suffering began. So at the very least, Joseph was a slave, then a prisoner for a decade before he meets the cupbearer and the baker. who incidentally both deserve to be where Joseph does not deserve to be. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both occupied roles in close proximity to the king. He daily put his life in their hands, the cupbearer in charge of the wine in his cup, the baker of the bread on his table. Thousands of years later, Jesus sanctifies both in a meal with his disciples, a meal we still celebrate today. There's just something about bread and wine that symbolize life and death. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Ironically, the captain of the guard is probably still Potiphar. We aren't certain, but if true, even though Potiphar threw Joseph into prison after his wife falsely accused him, he still trusts Joseph. This also means he may have just been saving face when he put Joseph in prison, because to defend him would have meant bearing the shame of a cheating wife. The narrator then uses another time marker after they had been in custody for some time. This means the three of them would have gotten to know each other pretty well. Each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream. Why would the narrator repeat something he just told us? He's making sure his audience, which now includes us, understand the positions they both once had. Remember, a central question in Joseph's story is who's in charge. They both had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Dreams are, of course, central in Joseph's story. They always occur in pairs, and the meanings of each typically reinforce one another, but not here. Here, the meanings are categorically opposite. Jesus grew in wisdom, and so does Joseph. He not only has the ability to interpret dreams accurately, he's able to distinguish between different meanings, even when the dreams come in a pair. When Joseph came to them the next morning, and this would have happened every morning, he saw that they were dejected. Joseph is not just wise, he's insightful. To borrow a phrase from Friday Night Lights, he has clear eyes and a full heart. Seeing their troubled hearts, his heart goes out to theirs. Why do you look so sad today? There are so many ironies in Joseph's story. In this scene, though he's in custody with them, he's also in charge of them. This former slave, now prisoner, because of his character and his gifts, possesses authority over two of Pharaoh's former closest confidants. As significant as this is, perhaps the greatest irony is that he cares. Don't forget who we're talking about. This is the same guy who pranced around in a colorful robe as a teenager, boasting to his brothers, even his parents, about his grandiose dreams that one day he would rule the universe. Do you see how God is using his suffering to transform him? How he has already gone from someone who cared only about himself to someone who now cares more about others? I think this is one of, if not the most significant quality of someone in charge. To care. Is this not what you intuitively look for in those who are in charge of you? And should it not be the most important quality you show to others, especially if you're in charge? Joseph cares. Do you? Do you notice when people are sad? Or are you more aware of yourself when you're down than you are of others when they're down? Self-awareness is a good thing, but there's something better. Other awareness. "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." If you want to be a leader, you have to care about those you're in charge of, especially when they're sad. Now add this. If you want to be a leader, you must also ask those you're in charge of to tell you their dreams. Are you pursuing your own dreams? Or are you asking others about their dreams? Do you try to paint yourself the hero? Or are you into making heroes? Joseph's dreams landed him at the bottom of a cistern, but his interpretation of someone else's dream begins his deliverance. The same Hebrew word translated dungeon later in this part of the story is used for cistern at the beginning of his story. Joseph's life is transformed by dreams and dungeons. The chief cupbearer said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." 3 quick observations. First, both men would have been nervous to share because they're afraid. Second, the cupbearer goes first, and you could say that he's just braver than the baker. But the more likely reason he's willing to stick his neck out first is that he's actually innocent. Third, the prevalence of the number 3. 3 branches, which budded, blossomed, ripened, 3. Then the cupbearer took them, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand, 3. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. Well, this inspires the baker. I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. The difference is pretty obvious. The cupbearer assumed his former role, handing Pharaoh his cup of wine. But the baker doesn't hand his bread to Pharaoh. Instead, birds come and eat it from the basket on his head. He doesn't even have the strength or presence of mind to shoo the birds away. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. I imagine both men, having just taken a drink of water, looking at each other and spitting it out of their mouths onto each other. Dreams played an important role in ancient Egypt. God gives Joseph the ability to interpret them. But Joseph is confident in God's ability, not his own. His interpretation reveals his wisdom, the ability to distinguish which of the 2 men was guilty. His willingness to interpret reveals that he embraces his gift. He has faith. The difference in meaning reveals Joseph is courageous. He gives good news to the cupbearer and bad news to the baker. Truth is like that. Truth includes bad news and good news. It's actually bad news before it's good news. The bad news is we're all so much worse than we think we are. And the good news is that we are all so much more loved than we could ever imagine. It's between the good news for the cupbearer and the bad news for the baker that there's curiously another but. It's a but we skipped. In verse 14, Joseph makes a request of the cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. The criminal on the cross next to Jesus made the same exact request. Remember me. And in case you forgot, the Hebrew word for dungeon is the same word used at the beginning for cistern. Joseph is changing, but he's also remaining the same. He's in flux. He trusts that God is in charge of his life, but he also seizes an opportunity to speak up for himself, which shows he's still human. Jesus did this too, the night he was arrested, as he was praying. The word lift, found in both interpretations, is also significant. It pictures a stark contrast. To the cupbearer, Joseph says, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. But to the baker, he says, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head. The difference between bad news and good news is vast, but it's also quite subtle sometimes. Recall that in the scene with Joseph and Potiphar's wife, the situation was entirely beyond Joseph's control. In this scene, it's more complex. Joseph asserts himself in a way he can control, first by using his gift to interpret dreams, and second, by making a request that the cupbearer could surely identify with. Ultimately, though, the outcome is still out of his control. He must trust God, which is our only option too. As a slave in his master's house, when Joseph was tempted, he trusted God. Now, as a prisoner in the king's prison, Joseph receives an opportunity to use his gift, and he goes for it. He acts in faith. God is looking for both, to trust him when we're tempted and to use the gifts he's given us. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. In other words, things played out exactly as Joseph said they would. But here's the rub, the final verse. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. This is not just a mental lapse. This is moral failure. And yet, even this tragic forgetting occurs under the watchful and present eye of God's providence. Joseph must continue to suffer, which is another way of saying his transformation is not yet complete. Neither is ours, so we must suffer. To close, and I will readily admit that this may be taking a little too much liberty with the text, but I can't help but point out how Jesus embraced a similar punishment to the one the baker deserved and received, so that we could be restored like the cupbearer, even though we don't deserve it. Our heads now lifted up only because his head was first lifted up on a cross. That and getting impaled on a pole sure sounds similar to getting crucified on a tree. Don't ever forget, Jesus was forgotten too, just like Joseph was. He was forgotten by his Father so that the same Father could remember us. He was forsaken like the baker so that we might be forgiven like the cupbearer. At every turn of the page in Joseph's story, we have the opportunity to see Jesus and to find ourselves. Amen.